In a bustling city filled with noise and chaos, there was a small, quiet park where people often went to escape the hustle and bustle of daily life. It was here, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, that a simple act of kindness set off a chain reaction that would change an entire community. It all started with an elderly woman named Mrs. Patel. She was a regular at the park, often seen sitting on a bench, feeding the pigeons and watching the world go by. One morning, as she was leaving the park, she noticed a young man sitting on a nearby bench, his head in his hands. He looked exhausted, his clothes rumpled, and his face etched with worry. Mrs. Patel approached him gently. "Are you all right, young man?" she asked. The man looked up, surprised. I'm fine," he mumbled, though his eyes told a different story. Mrs. Patel sat down beside him. "Sometimes, it helps to talk," she said softly. The man hesitated, then began to pour out his troubles. His name was Raj, and he had lost his job a month ago. He was struggling to pay rent and put food on the table for his young daughter. He felt like a failure. Mrs. Patel listened patiently, her kind eyes filled with compassion. When Raj finished, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. "This is for you," she said, handing it to him. Raj opened the envelope and gasped. Inside was enough money to cover his rent for the next month. "I can't accept this," he said, his voice trembling. "You can," Mrs. Patel replied with a warm smile. "And you will. Sometimes, we all need a little help. Just promise me that when you're back on your feet, you'll help someone else in need." Raj nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I will. I promise." Raj kept his promise. A few months later, after finding a new job, he was walking through the park when he noticed a young woman sitting on a bench, crying. He approached her and asked if she was okay. She explained that she had just been evicted from her apartment and didn't know where to go. Raj remembered Mrs. Patel's kindness and knew what he had to do. He gave the woman enough money to cover a week's stay at a nearby hostel and helped her connect with a local charity that could provide further assistance. "Thank you," the woman said, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You don't have to," Raj replied. "Just promise me that when you're back on your feet, you'll help someone else in need." The woman, whose name was Priya, kept her promise. A few weeks later, she volunteered at a soup kitchen, serving meals to the homeless. One of the people she served was an elderly man who had lost everything in a fire. Moved by his story, Priya helped him find temporary housing and connected him with a social worker. The elderly man, in turn, began volunteering at a local community center, where he met a single mother struggling to make ends meet. He offered to babysit her children so she could take on extra shifts at work. The single mother, grateful for the help, began donating her old clothes and toys to a shelter for women and children. One of the women at the shelter, inspired by the gesture, started a support group for other single mothers in the community. Over time, the ripple effect of Mrs. Patel's initial act of kindness spread throughout the city. People began to look out for one another, offering help and support wherever it was needed. The park, once a place of solitude, became a hub of community activity, with people gathering to share stories, resources, and acts of kindness. Mrs. Patel, now in her late 80s, watched it all unfold with a quiet sense of pride. She never sought recognition for her actions, but her simple act of kindness had sparked a movement that touched countless lives. Years later, Raj stood in the park, now a thriving community space filled with laughter and joy. He had become a successful businessman, but he never forgot the kindness that had changed his life. He often visited Mrs. Patel, bringing her flowers and sharing stories of how her generosity had inspired him to help others. "You started all of this," Raj said, gesturing to the bustling park. "Your kindness changed everything." Mrs. Patel smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Kindness is like a pebble thrown into a pond," she said. "The ripples it creates can travel far beyond what we can see." And so, the ripple effect continued, spreading hope, compassion, and love throughout the community, one act of kindness at a time.